All right. Hey, friends. Hope this works. I'm trying something new. I am recording a seminar on racism on my on Zoom, and then also simultaneously Facebook Living it. So hopefully this works. Um, for a while now, I've been wrestling through, probably since Philando Castile, wrestling through a number of the racial tensions and division that we have in our country. And you know, there's a lot out there to read, and I have more on Kindle, more on Audible. I've read them all in its entirety, but I've been steeped in this literature and trying to humbly learn from people who have been doing this and thinking through this a lot longer than I have. And one of the challenges that I found is kind of like Proverbs. It says this, Proverbs 18:17. The one who states his case first seems right until the other comes and examines him. And I'll read one book and I'm like, man, that's it. Oh my gosh, this is the answer. And then I read the other side and feel very uncertain. And this is just happening. We have multiple sides and we talking past each other. And for many of us, it feels very disorienting, especially those who are trying to be fair, who are trying to stand for what is true and not just go with the flow of whatever our side or our assumed side would just say. And being in the middle is very, very uncomfortable, confusing, disorienting. And so I want to help those like me who are trying to think about these issues as a Christian. And so this seminar is for my church and for any other Christians out there, or even non-Christians who want to know maybe what the Bible has to say about all of this. Does Jesus have something to say about racism in our country? Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down this book called Beyond Racial Gridlock by Dr. George Yancey. He is a professor, Black professor, and has written a number of books on racism and just basically our issues in our country. And he comes from a Christian perspective. Now, there's lots of books worthy of consideration, understanding the history of racism, understanding the differences between institutional, structural racism, personal racism, stories to read and sympathize and feel. Oh, there's so much out there, thinking through police brutality. There's so many different things, but what's the lens that you have and that I have as we weigh through all of this data? And if you don't understand your lens and the strengths of that lens and the weaknesses of that lens and the temptations of that lens based off your brokenness that you have and that we all have, you're going to make some huge errors. And so this book is very helpful in providing a framework of the four major lenses or models of how we approach racial issues. And then Dr. George Yancey provides a fifth model that he is presenting as a way forward. Now, I just want to make a few more clarifications. This book is an imperfect book, like all books outside of God's word, but it's very helpful. And I agree with the majority of what he says. Now, even though I say that, and the elders at All People's Church gave me the green light on this content, and they reviewed some reviews of this book, and they green light it, that doesn't mean that everything that I say here representing George Yancey is perfectly representing him well, because sometimes I can misread people or misrepresent people with unintentionally with lack of nuance and so forth. And furthermore, does not mean that I represent every opinion of all the elders at APC. We are in unity in the essentials, but there are specifics that we would disagree on. So I just want to clarify that. This will be up on YouTube, and this will be saved for our members and for further discussion and reflection. I'm not going to thoroughly go through everything here, but I want to give you a good overview that I think would really serve you as it served me, as I felt very drowning. I felt like I've been drowning in all these articles, podcasts, and so forth, all these opinions, trying to shape my opinion and trying to understand, okay, what would God have me think? And so this book is not going to tell you what to think, but maybe how to think about these narratives being thrown at us. And I just highly recommend you to pick up this book. It is so helpful, so fair. And so let me kind of tell you where we're heading with this book and the kind of the thesis. I'm going to pull up I'm going to do a slideshow here now, and hopefully this will work. So Lord help this. Okay, now So what racial lens do you have? I hope this works. Here's a couple of key points if you want to know where we're heading. There are 4 major lenses that people wear as they think through racial issues in the US. All 4 focus on a single explanation for why racism is a problem in our society. The first 2 tend towards to be favored by conservatives and usually majority culture. The last 2 by liberals and primarily by minority culture. These are generalizations, and as I go through these 4, I'm going to go into more depth. But I do want to clarify that these are generalizations, and some people will have a mixture of these views and lenses, and it'd be very unfair to try to pigeonhole every single person into one of these categories. And obviously, George Yancey brings a 5th category, so he's not even including himself in this. So color blindness would be the #1 lens, and probably one of the most common lenses, especially for conservatives, white conservatives, and probably a general kind of standpoint for many in our country. The source of the problem for color blindness is our failure to recognize that race is unimportant. We'll get into that more later. #2, Anglo conformity. The source of the problem is the inability of racial minorities to adjust to the majority economic and social system. In other words, they're poor and they need help, they need resources, they need training, and so forth. #3, again, we're going to get into all this, is oversimplistic. Multiculturalism. This is going to be more on the left side, typically, politically. The problem comes from the dominance of Eurocentric culture, and so we got to lift up minority culture and history and people. And finally, white responsibility, or others would call this kind of the mindset of Black Lives Matter movement, or as an organization especially. And it's this: the majority group, white people, are the problem. I miswrote that. I said it is the problem. Now, here's a few more key points. Yancey asserts that all 4 models fail as the result of a common denial of the nature of sin. Each of the models in fundamental ways fall short of comprehending the extent and depth of sin in the individual or the society. Each lens, because of sin nature, will be tempted to minimize accountability and be released from responsibility. The groups who have benefited from historical abuse tend to want everyone to forget about the past and move on. The groups, on the other hand, that have been historically abused tend to want to focus on historical evils and gain recompense for the wrongs done to them. Final points on the key points as I just summarize where we're heading. Yancey argues that only Christianity provides a proper model of racial reconciliation because it does not hide the pervasive brokenness of both individuals, regardless of color, and the systems those individuals build. The secular world fails to find an answer to racial woes since it denies the spiritual reality of the problem. Yancey covers the strengths and weaknesses of each of these models, and then he finally proposes his model called the mutual responsibility or mutual obligation model, which is he proposes is a thoroughly Christian grounded model and a way forward for our nation. All right. Now, before we get into the 4 lenses, we need to understand the 2 kind of definitions or understandings of racism. And we're going to get into this more. We're doing a podcast series at our church trying to help our church and others think through these matters, this cultural moment we find ourselves in, how to love people well. And the way you define racism is going to drastically affect your lens and the solutions you are going to offer. So next week, we're going to plan on going deeper into those definitions, but to use Yancey's definitions, there are 2 dominant ways in which people in the United States define racism. There's 2, the individual definition and the structuralist definition. An individual's understanding defines racism as something overt that can be done only by one individual to another. So it's a personal racism. According to a structuralist understanding, society can perpetuate racism even when the individuals in society do not intend to be racist or in themselves are not overtly racist. So the first 2 models, based on more individual definition, color blindness and Anglo conformity, tend towards an individualistic definition. And the final two, being white responsibility and multiculturalism, are going to focus more on a structural point of view. These two different definitions need to tension, because individualists, they do not understand why fixing structures in society is so important, or they even see that there's such as racism in structural situations. And on the other hand, structuralists, the other two models or lenses, believe that individualists are insensitive to the real issues of racial inequality. Now, with that framework in mind, we're going to now wade through in more detail the four models that Yancey identifies as common. And if you're just logging in, I don't even know if I'm on Facebook Live anymore, so hopefully I'm not talking to anyone. This is all being recorded, going to be put on YouTube and shared with our church. So the first model by Dr. Yancey identifies is called color blindness. Color blindness, and this is probably pretty self-explanatory by just the name. Color blindness has its desire to make race a non-issue in society. So color blindness defines racism as overt acts of hostility to an individual based on physical characteristics. So they would affirm that racism still exists, but more of an individual level. And it denies the existence of structural problems. The solution, therefore, is to deny that these characteristics have any value or meaning. Let's explain that a little more. The core argument of the colorblindness model is simple. To end racism, we have to ignore racial reality. Advocates of colorblindness contend that efforts to alleviate our economic racial divide only elevate the importance of race, which in turn only reinforces the negative power of race in our society. I missed you. Okay, I'm in the middle of doing something, honey. Say hi. Okay, bye. I gotta go. I knew that was gonna happen, and that's my fault because I didn't lock the door. So I'm gonna lock the door now. So where was I? So advocates of colorblindness contend that efforts to alleviate our economic racial divide only elevate the importance of race, which in turn only reinforces the negative power of race in our society. They say that if we only stop talking about race and taking into account, racism will lose its power to alienate people from each other. The aim is to get beyond racial issues. The colorblind vision is of a society in which racial features such as skin color and facial structures are no more important than height or hair color. Then there will be no judgment based on race because race will carry no social importance. Now, colorblindness, Yancey argues, has its roots in the civil rights movement. They ground their philosophy in sentiments like when MLK said in his famous I Have a Dream speech, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And so a colorblind model is going to emphasize merits and character and personal choices. And that's what they want people to judge by, not by the color of the skin or the people group you belong to. He notes, Yancey, that many believe that we have now achieved equality and thus strive to be a colorblind society. Now, here's some of the strengths of colorblindness according to Yancey. Colorblindness was instrumental in dismantling discriminatory laws like laws on interracial marriage, right? Which makes sense, right? If the rationale of colorblindness is that it doesn't matter what race you are, then it shouldn't matter who you marry or who you love. And so this was a very positive way to approach these discriminatory racist laws. It also helps correct the tendency of some racial minorities who look for problems of racism when they do not exist. For example, there are times where a Black brother or sister will experience very wicked actions from a white person. And it may be racially motivated, but it could be that white person is just evil and mean to everybody, regardless of race. They're mean to their wife, they're mean to anybody they know, and that's who they are. And so colorblindness would push against the default jerk assumption that every negative action is racially charged, but it could be for other reasons. Another strength of colorblindness, if no one ever considered race, like truly, like a lot of people say that, But if no one actually really considered race, there would be no overt racism. And finally, it reflects in ways a key Christian truth that our race, sex, and nationality has nothing to do with our position before God, which is a beautiful thing. Now, this lens has weaknesses, like all of them do. Now let's look at the weaknesses of colorblindness. Weaknesses of colorblindness. Number one, it tends to ignore the pain and suffering racial minorities have undergone. When we say, hey, I don't see your color, I don't see that at all, I just relate to you as an individual, we can subtly undermine the history, the pain, the suffering, past and present, that these brothers and sisters may be experiencing or have experienced. It also tends to not take seriously, colorblindness, the fact that whites still benefit from historical oppressive racial structures. So I want to try to take this away from even the black and white discussion. Yancey, who's black, explains how he benefits of being a homeowner living on land that was once owned by Native Americans, which was unjustly taken and years ago, and he benefits from it today. So he's trying to use that as a common example. This is going to be a highly debated one, but let's keep going. Next, another weakness of colorblindness is it diminishes the influence of race and culture on a person. It's like saying, hey, I don't see your disability, I just see you as a normal person. Yet the failure to see and recognize if someone is dismembered or has some disability is to diminish the reality of how that disability has shaped their life. And when you deny that, you deny very much an essential aspect of who they are. For example, if you know the show This Is Us, there's a really powerful situation where Randall is speaking to his father, and his father says, son, I don't see you as black, I just see you as my son. And then Randall looks at him and says, well, then you don't really see me. And what his father was failing to realize is that Randall, growing up in a very white area, experiencing racism and discrimination, when his dad just emphasizes that he's just another person, it's like he's not really understanding and recognizes the unique challenges and context that Randall has as a black boy growing up with white adopted parents. So that's another example of that. This mindset, this weakness of colorblindness can be used as a cop-out for those who want to ignore current racial inequalities. And they're often going to tend to say all lives matter, rather than say, hey, why do you say Black Lives Matter? Why do you think that your life doesn't matter? Because I think it does, or I think I do. Tell me about that. It's going to just be very dismissive, say, hey, all lives matter. Stop saying that Black Lives Matter, all lives matter. Let's talk about the next one, Anglo-conformity. Anglo-conformity is another lens or model that desires to teach minorities the proper way to succeed in life. This includes education, like how to find and keep a job, etc. The majority must teach people of color how to succeed, while the minority is responsible for taking those lessons to heart so they can achieve economic and educational success. That's what Yancey writes. Fundamentally, this approach finds the problems to be socioeconomic as opposed to being about race. And they're going to highlight that a lot of the issues that we have are class-based and economically grounded rather than racially grounded. Anglo-conformity is very materialistic in their model. At its core, it's the belief that the real source of racism is racial strife, is economic disparity between racial minorities and the majority. Let's talk about some of the strengths. Research shows that economic disparities do in fact exacerbate racial animosity. So if we address economic issues, then we will eliminate many racial issues. Another strength, they try to empower minorities to be the source of their own economic distress, rather perpetual dependence. And this is a fact that humans thrive when they're empowered and can take control of their own life. And long-term dependency and victimhood will actually destroy a people group. And so their strength is that they are going to try to ignore the challenges and just build them up and say, you can do this, let me help you do this. Proponents of this model can often think about some of the most creative and helpful ways to help racial minorities overcome their economic disadvantages, because they're so laser focused on economic disparity and helping people with education and jobs and all that kind of stuff. So much is that they can be very creative and helpful with some of their solutions. Now, what are some of the weaknesses of Anglo conformity? Drink for a second. Excuse me. One of the weaknesses is it downplays the history and context racial minorities are in. Excuse me. I just drank the water on the wrong pipe. They downplay racial minorities, the context in the history, which heavily influences and hurts their ability to succeed. And so you can have your outliers like an Obama, who has the odds stacked against them and overcomes these impossible obstacles. However, the majority will struggle. And if you just focus on the outliers and say, hey, look, here's a Black person who succeeded, and look, they've done what we've done, and they've embraced our culture and our work ethic and our mindset. Look, it can be done. They're an example that all this other stuff you're talking about is stupid. Look at this person. But it often will downplay the very many challenges that the average Black person or minority will have to work through. Also, other weakness is it often ignores the role of intergenerational wealth transfer. A great book to consider this is The Color of the Law. Side note. This model also places too much emphasis on physical nature of the problem. It's a very materialistic worldview. If minorities simply had more money or more education or more things, then their problems would be solved. And historically, no, this is not true of all people groups, that if you just have enough things, then you're going to be able to get out of the situation. Finally, also, the model suffers from making white and European definitions of hard work, success, and wealth the universal definition of all racial groups. In other words, it discounts the fact that other people groups have different aspects of their culture that are valuable and helpful to learn from, and that there's not one way to be economically successful. For instance, a majority culture mindset is very individualistic, which has strengths to it. But one of the weaknesses is that they don't work together. And so using Korean immigrants as example, when they moved over here, they would often pool their money together, share it to buy businesses and property and get that rolling, and then feed back into the system. Eventually, many Korean Americans within a community could own their own businesses and their own homes as they work together with their wealth. That would almost never happen in a white community. And so that's a very strong, beautiful thing from that culture that an Anglo conformity mindset would not usually affirm or even consider. Now let's talk about the ones on the left. So we've been talking about the two primary lenses that politically right people would have and majority culture would hold. And this is all speaking in generalities, obviously. Now we're going to talk about the left side on the other aisle, multiculturalism and white responsibility. Now let's talk about multiculturalism. It deals with racial alienation by emphasizing the value and worth of minority cultures. Racial minority individuals and their subcultures are held in low esteem by dominant society, and so we must find worth in those individuals and cultures. Multiculturalism forms its philosophy, believing first in the uniqueness, intrinsic value, and good of every culture and tradition. And no matter where we find multiculturists, they lay the blame, this is where Yancey writes, they lay the blame for racism squarely on majorities' denial of the worth of non-white racial groups and their cultural norms. Finally, advocates of this approach long to preserve cultures of all people and see them as helpful contributors to the world. Now, what are the strengths? It helps us correct some of the excess of our Eurocentric society, thinking white culture is normal and that is expected, right? Another one is multiculturalism promotes important critical reflection on the shortcomings and weaknesses of Western culture and affirms the positives of non-Western cultures, which are often overlooked. They can help This framework can help celebrate the positive aspects of minority culture in history. Theoretically, allows for the creation of a society that focuses on the cultural strengths of all combined people groups. Sounds beautiful, huh? Now, the weaknesses of multiculturalism is that multiculturalism can tend to overlook minority shortcomings. For example, hopefully I don't get too much trouble with this, but growing up, my experience and the experience of many other Black brothers and sisters that I have, that if they work hard in school, they could be criticized, or often were criticized by their fellow Black friends of being a white person, trying to be white, trying to be an Oreo, being an Oreo. And so this is a weakness in that culture that can happen, and it's not always the case, obviously, but can often happen, that is shared by many, not all, that needs to be called out. But multiculturalism will tend to not talk about any of the weaknesses of any culture at all, except majority culture. It also can assume moral relativism and downplay sin. In other words, everything is fine. Any culture, no matter what, is good. Whatever they believe and whatever they hold, it's all good and it's all true. We need to celebrate and affirm all of it without distinction. And the Bible has nothing to say into those cultures. And when we try to speak truth into any culture, the tendency is to accuse them of imperialism, whitewashing, and trying to control things. Finally, in practice, multiculturalism focuses mainly on the weaknesses of majority culture, and, like I said, struggles to celebrate the strengths and weaknesses of it, while also not recognizing weaknesses of other cultures. White responsibility, the fourth lens. This argument, also, Yancey in another video talks about how he calls this Black Lives Matter. This is the mindset of BLM. This argument suggests that the problem of racism are primarily because of the majority people group. Thus, the responsibility of the majority people group, whites, is to end racism. Whites have too much power and they abuse that power, and so their power needs to be taken from them. Many proponents of this position argue that minorities are completely incapable of being racist. Yancey writes, from their viewpoint, racial minorities can have prejudice, but they cannot be racist because racism requires structural power. Since only dominant group members have structural power in our society, only dominant group members, whites, practice racism. In other words, racism is understood as prejudice plus power. And if you have prejudice but not power, you can't be racist. You have to have both. And so only white people, or whoever is the majority culture in whatever society, they're the ones who can be racist. Also, white responsibility argues that we should destroy institutions that exploit racial minorities for the benefit of the majority, and holds that racial minorities have little role in solving the problem, except to bring racial issues to the attention of white. Look at some of the strengths. Two strengths to highlight, Yancey highlights. The greatest strength of white responsibility is its ability to point out subtle ways in which the majority dominates society, perpetuates racism. In other words, they do not play with racism. They see it and they can call it out. Also, it recognizes the ways in which the majority dominates society, and it refuses to ignore racial problems or institutional and historic racism. Now, here are the weaknesses, according to George Yancey. The model then denies that minorities have a responsibility for racial tensions, even going as far to say minorities cannot be racist. The irony is white responsibility model often denies the agency of people of color. There's also a tendency to alienate whites with their rhetoric or the way they speak about things, many who feel that they're being attacked already feel guilty, and so no matter what they do, they're guilty. The result can often be apathy, inaction, or disdain. I'll never please you, this is never enough, and they just shut down. Also, white responsibility allows racial minorities to play the race card and blame whites solely for their own problems. Now, the challenge to this is that sometimes things are the race are directly racially charged and motivated, and sometimes they're not. And if you hold a white responsibility model, you can tend to pull the race card for everything, which eventually becomes like a boy cries who cried wolf. And so when there really is a racial problem, the majority group has been so desensitized by hearing the calls and cries of injustice, of racism in times where they discerned that it wasn't there, that when it truly is there, they just disregard it. Finally, like multiculturalism, white responsibility focuses mainly on the weakness of majority culture and struggles to celebrate the strengths and successes, while simultaneously having immunity towards any weaknesses in their own minority culture. Now, that was a lot. And if you're sticking with me, kudos to you. Now, we're going to talk about the key weaknesses all of them share, because all of them have strengths and weaknesses. But here are the key weaknesses of all of them. And there are a lot. Let me read this from Yancey from page 79. Each of the four secular models identifies one source of racial conflict and proposes solutions to deal with that source. Certainly, each source is at last partially responsible for racial alienation. The strength of these models lies in the recognition of a particular cause of racial tension and their effort to resolve it. Good, right? Their weakness, though, lies in their refusal to identify other sources of the problem. At best, these incomplete models can help us correct certain aspects of racial tension, but they will never eradicate the problem. In other words, all of them highlight one major problem, and they may be right, but in the dismantling or the disregard of other problems, and therefore their solutions and their recognition of the problem are limited. Now, here's the big point in racial Yancey's book. All of these models ignore human depravity. All these models ignore human depravity. If you're not familiar with that term, you can basically sin nature. All of these models assume that people are genuinely just good, and they just need the right environment and influences. Their nature is good, but their nurture needs adjusting. And the Bible teaches that all people have sinned. All people are culpable of sins. All people are guilty. All people have selfish tendencies. All people have brokenness. And what these models tend to do is they tend to identify the greatest sin in the other people groups. And in doing so, they negate their own responsibility, their own sin issues, their own problems. Furthermore, each of these models have the worldview that all humans are perfectible. They just need the right nurturing, like I said. They just need the right information, the right environment. So this is key in the mindset of abolish the police. If you listen to the most helpful thinkers and communicators of that movement, they're going to say, hey, let's get to the root issues of our communities of crime. Instead of putting our money into keepers of the peace or people to react towards crime, let's proactively help them have mentors and have great social programs and mental health professionals. And if we have enough of that, we will eliminate crime. Now, there's a lot of truth to that those factors can really truly help and lower crime. Stats have been shown to do that. However, what they assume is that humans are generally good provided they have good environments, and they fail to realize that there's a sin nature problem and that all of us struggle with sin and selfishness at a variety of levels. And that if they have all these social programs, people will still commit crimes, albeit less, but still will. On the other hand, for those who have an Anglo-conformity mindset, we could just give you guys good monetary policies and good social programs or good training. And they fail to realize that at the end of the day, that's not the issue in people's life. That is a issue, but it's not the core issue. And you can't just perfect someone with enough training and education and enough information. We need a heart transfer. That can only happen through Jesus. Another key weakness is that white selfishness will tempt them to downplay historical atrocities, to minimize the existence of racism today point the finger and ignore their responsibility to rectify racial disparities. On the other hand, non-whites' sinfulness will tempt them to overstate their grievances, to manipulate whites and accuse whites of being responsible for all their problems. More key weaknesses. Our sin nature drives majority group members to look for both overt and subtle ways to maintain the advantages of their racial status. Now, the sin nature of colored or POCs is to use their victim status to gain whatever they can. Both have a problem, both are tempted. If we encourage the victims of oppression to see themselves only as people who have been sinned against and not also as sinners themselves, equally in need of a savior, then we have undermined the gospel. In other words, if we separate society in two classes, the oppressor and the oppressed, and only focus on the oppressed, the oppression of the people, then we can subtly communicate or overtly communicate that they are not sinners and they don't need the grace of Jesus and forgiveness from God through the cross of Christ. And when you do that, you undermine the gospel and undermine the greatest need of every human heart. So for both oppressors and oppressed, we both, no matter where you're on that spectrum, we both need the cross of Christ. We both need forgiveness of sins. We both are sinners needing God's grace. Now, let's talk about the racial gridlock that these weaknesses produce. This is the fear cycle George Yancey identifies. Whites ignore racism. Typically, these are all generalities again. Please don't overly read into each one of these statements. Whites ignore race issues by adopting a colorblind ideology, which leads minorities to fear that racism will not be taken seriously. Minorities then have fear, which causes them to adopt a multiculturalist or white responsibility model. Minorities then play the race card, makes whites fear that they will be labeled racist regardless of what they say or do, leading them to redouble their efforts for a colorblind philosophy. And this vicious cycle of dysfunctional race relations continues with the fears of whites and the fears of people of color feeding on each other and exasperating each other. So George Yancey says, hey, there's a better way to do this. We ought to look like the world and adopt these models and speak like them and have these gotcha videos. Hey, did you see how this guy destroyed this guy arguments, or this guy, him, saying negative things about an Obama quote when he thought it was a Trump quote? Like all this gotcha kind of journalism is not the way of Jesus. And so there's another way forward that George Yancey proposes. Now, this way forward is not the end all be all of all the answers, but it's the framework, the foundation, the lens that we can adopt, the model that from which we can build all these specific solutions to the many ills in our society. So this is called the mutual obligation model or the mutual responsibility model. So for Christians, we are especially in a good situation to learn from Jesus's life because he was neither at the top nor the bottom of society. At times, he was a member of the majority group, and at times he was part of the minority group. He was both a man, which would be the majority group, and he was also a Jew, which would be the minority group without power. A careful reading of the gospel shows that even as he sought relationships with members of other ethnic groups, Jesus also dealt with issues of oppression and justice. So we have a model to follow in Jesus in his life, death, and resurrection. So the mutual obligation model is this. It's a Christian-based approach whereby we recognize that people of all races have a sin nature that has to be accounted for. Thus, everyone has obligation to work towards healthy interracial communications to solve racial problems. Okay? Everyone has sin nature and everyone has an obligation to work together to collectively come up with solutions. These obligations are going to look different for everyone, but we all have the responsibility to play our part. We have to acknowledge, though, that we will all have a temptation to look for solutions that will primarily benefit us instead of benefiting others. And again, we have to keep the fact that we all have temptations and sin nature that will be tempting us in certain directions. Also, one of the benefits of the mutual obligation model is that nobody gets to dictate or demand his or her answers to others. we work together to find answers, knowing our sinful temptations that we bring to the table. We all have baggage, and everyone gets a chance to be heard, and we work together. We should do our best to hold others accountable for their sins, but never with a haughty attitude. So for whites, Yancey writes, this means becoming less judgmental of the complaints of people of color, and notice this word, looking for the validity of their complaints. For people of color, this means more restrained in how they express their concerns, because they know that their own sin nature will seduce them to exaggerate their concerns so they can gain power. In other words, from a person of privilege or a place of power in being in majority culture, the tendency is going to want to point the finger at minority culture and say it's all your fault, and you just need to do these things, and totally dismiss any of their complaints as being unreasonable or misinformed or whatever it is. And on the other hand, people of color are going to have a tendency to take any grievance they have, make it a racial issue first and foremost, and then exaggerate it in order to state their case. Now, again, these are the temptations. This does not mean that everyone does it, but we have to know the baggage and the temptation we bring to the table. Furthermore, Yancey describes the need for whites to have sorrow for the historic contemporary mistreatment of people of color. It is a goal for European Americans will be grieved to realize that they benefit from racism, even though they are not racists themselves, and that they will seek to understand more the plight of people of color because they want to end the pain of racism. Now, George Yancey will call this corporate repentance. That's going to be hotly debated by many who reject the idea of corporate repentance. And that's something we're going to get into in future podcasts. Now, George Yancey says this, the flip side of corporate repentance is corporate forgiveness. Remember, mutual responsibility and obligation. Both sides have something that they need to do and care about, which does not mean that minorities keep silence about racial injustice, but it does mean that they abdicate their right to bash whites over the head with their own repentance. Instead, now have a responsibility to work with whites and listen to their concerns also. Finally, one of the best ways to heal racial strife is to fellowship with Christians of different races. Yancey, in his final chapters, goes into different practical approaches you can have, and this is just a few of them. For racial perceptions to be influenced by interracial friendships, we must be involved in social networks that are thoroughly multiracial. And finally, Yancey is fully aware that he cannot provide the perfect answer to racism this side of glory. He ends the book with a plea for Christians, and I plead with you too, to contribute to more complete solutions. Now, I want to have some final thoughts as we end this slideshow. All right, so I have no idea if anyone's watching live, but we just finished an overview of George Yancey or Dr. Yancey's Beyond the Racial Gridlock, which I found immensely helpful as in producing the lens in which how we approach the data and the arguments and the debate, and so we can find a word as a church, God willing, to bring harmony in our nation. I hope I did justice to him. Please pick this book up. This is not the end-all book, but it will be kind of a key to understand many of the other issues. And if we can identify the lenses we are all tempted to wear, the baggage that comes with it, the strengths that comes with it, then we're going to be in a lot better position as we come to the table and work together to find healing and unity in our nation through Jesus. And so hopefully this was helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to put in the comments, and I will do what I can to answer them with my limited time, but also limited expertise. And we're going to continue this series next week, and Pastor Ross and Daniel will be joining me on that one. So thank you so much for your time, and if you made it this far, appreciate you.